I wanted to ask you, you talked, I want to bring the discussion, if you don't mind, back to something that we were touching on earlier, that your initial objection when you were at Evergreen to whatever it was that was developing in the background. And now we've had 4 years to see whatever it is manifesting itself. And so what is it? What is it that's happening, do you think, in our politicized landscape? I mean,
well, I have a guess, and it's right up your alley. It's something I'm intending to explore at greater length. But the basics are this, I suspect. You and I think, would share the opinion that psychological development is among the most important phenomena for understanding human beings, and it is underrated. We tend to look at the behavior of adults and study it, but we should spend more time thinking about how those adults ended up the way they did in order to really understand them. And I think for each generation, you have a developmental landscape, and what the governing forces are in that developmental landscape has a lot to say about both the insights and the blind spots of the people who emerge from it. And so I would say that for Americans of my generation, I'm a Gen X, the market played too much of a role developmentally, and it has created a kind of lens through which we can't help but look. It has, commodified things in a way that is quite unhealthy.
You were born when?
I was born in 1969.
Okay.
For millennials, and maybe even more so for Gen Z, I suspect that there is a pivot to something else. And many people, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have certainly talked about iGen, the internet generation. But what I suspect is really going on is that if you are sufficiently plugged into the internet early enough, there comes a point at which your persona on the internet takes primacy. It is more important than your actual physical life persona.
It's worse than that. It's worse than that, I would say, from personal experience. There's more of me on the internet than there is in me. My electronic avatars are far more powerful than me, personally, And right. I can watch this because I've been away for a year and a half, and yet my internet presence has steadily increased during that time. And I look online now, and it's 700 million views, something like that.
So now imagine that as the developmental environment for children. Now here's the connection I want to draw. My contention is that the online landscape is postmodern, right? That if we were just to simply describe it, the rules, the physics of online life are postmodern.
Because it's abstracted from the environment.
Right. So, for example,
it's like living in a dictionary.
If I decided tomorrow that I was a woman, right, I could change my internet presence such that I would present in a female way. I could say, hey, anybody who doesn't treat me as female is a jerk. And the point is, I have transitioned completely, right? Now, obviously, there's no such thing in the physical world. You can transition, you can take hormones or blockers, you can get surgeries, but no man has ever become a woman and reproduced in a female way, right? So the point is, the physical world has all kinds of constraints that come from physics and biology, which do not translate to the online world. And for people like you and me, for whom the online world is an add-on world, we think, well, obviously real life is the important one. And then the online thing has some interface with it, which is frightening, but we understand how they relate. But if you reverse these two things, then what you get is a generation that its problem-solving mind says, actually, of course you can transition. You can transition, and then it is everybody's obligation to live by who you've told us you are, and anybody who doesn't is a bad person. And what has to be true for that to be the case, right?
You know, I had a fantasy a long while ago that people would end up wearing glasses, like the Google glasses, that would be illegal to take off, and that you'd be mandated to see what people wanted you to see. It was their right to be presented to you in the manner that they chose to present themselves. You know, and I'm not saying that's a particularly brilliant vision, but it's very much in keeping with what you're describing. So,
yep, I think it's close. But if you imagine then that an online world in which effectively we can all be equal tomorrow as long as we say that that's the objective, and we can all present as we want, and others can be forced to adhere to it or be thrown off of whatever discussion, then all of this begins to make a great deal of sense. And so I'm wondering if we are not, in effect, in a kind of civil war between those for whom the real world has primacy and those for whom the online world has primacy. And if that's not the fundamental nature of the battle.
Well, I think it could be the fundamental nature of a part of the battle. I mean, obviously part of what's going on is whatever this unbelievably rapid rate of technological transformation is doing to us. I mean, my daughter and some people of approximately her age, so late 20s, are helping me with manage social media, let's say. She's noticed that people 5 years younger than her have advantages in understanding the newly developed forms of social media that she's already outside of. And so that process of being hooked into the web and that being the determining factor for your worldview is probably accelerating. I mean, it's going to accelerate. Obviously, it's going to accelerate because the web is becoming more and more dominant and machines are becoming more and more intelligent. So they abstract themselves away from the world. And then the question is, well, what's the consequence of that abstraction? But it's funny that it's postmodern. That doesn't... There's more going on with whatever it is that's happening than technological transformation. But you think that's the fundamental driving factor?
Well, I think there are a lot of ways you can look at it. Obviously, I don't think this is a real battle. Obviously, the internet runs on hardware in the real world, and everybody, you know, when the power goes out, we are all reduced to our biological selves. So I don't think there is actually anything to fight over. One of these worlds has primacy and the other is an add-on, and this is not debatable. But my point is really about the mental confusion that arises from, for most people, I mean, if you think about the lives that most people are living, right? Most people at best are working a job in which they trade their labor for money that they get to spend on goods or relatively generic adventures. And the part of their life that is interesting and compelling is, you know, the internet, over which they range freely and engage in battle, and, you know, they fall in love increasingly and whatever else they do. And so my point is that is a distortion developmentally. It misleads the mind into misunderstanding what is necessary. If you take the postmodern rules of the internet and you now impose them on politics in the real world, you get crises. You get the basic structure of civilization coming apart in front of our eyes, which I really believe that it is, right? With the homelessness crisis in the US, for example, is jaw-dropping. And we have a particularly acute crisis on the West Coast in the US that appears to be the result of people being utterly compelled of their own political beliefs to an extent that even as those beliefs are failing around them visibly, they just double down. So imagining that people who think the internet has primacy are now exerting a force to correct the real world in the direction of their naive internet understanding of things are in danger of crashing the aircraft. And in some sense, people like you and me are responding to what they're saying about how we should restructure the real world and saying that doesn't make sense. It won't work. It is going to put us in grave danger. It is going to disrupt essential things. And, there are those who can hear us, and we are popular with those who can hear us. And then there are those who regard our pointing out the obvious as a danger to their program, who are intent on silencing us. And
so I had thought about this obsession with identity from a developmental perspective too. And I thought this insistence by a loud minority that their determination of their identity take primacy is, first of all, it's wrong technically, I think, because an identity isn't merely what you feel you are. An identity is way more complicated than that, as any decent social constructionist should already know. An identity is a role, a set of complex roles that you negotiate with other people so that you can thrive across a very long span of time. And it can't be something that you impose on other people, because then they won't cooperate with you. Now, you might say that you have a right to impose certain aspects of it on other people, and you could have a reasonable debate about that. But identity is definitely not merely what you feel it is, and it's certainly not merely what you feel it is moment to moment. That identity is actually much more like that of a 3 or 4 year old child. And I mean this technically, it's not an insult. So when you're a child, you pick up one identity after another and play with them. So for example, my granddaughter, who's about 3 at the moment, if you ask her who she is, she has 2 names, a first name and a second name, and her dad calls her by her second name and her mom calls her by her first name. So she's Ellie or Scarlett, and she's fine with either of those. But she's also Pocahontas. And if you ask her whether she's Ellie or Scarlett or Pocahontas, she will say Pocahontas. And she has said that for 8 months. It's amazing. It's been that persistent in a child of that age. It's quite remarkable. But what she's doing is playing, and girls will play to be boys at that age, and boys will play to be girls. And they play with multitudinous identities, and then they settle into one. So then the question is, what if you disrupt that play? That's fantasy play. And then another question might be, well, what if you disrupt it with technology? Not that technology itself is producing a message that's counter to that, but that the fact that children are on technology all the time means they're not engaging in that kind of identity establishing fantasy play. And then you might say, well, maybe what you see happening in that case is that it bursts out in late adolescence. And the insistence there that my identity is what I say it is actually the scream in some sense of an organism that hasn't gone through that egocentric period of play where they are, in a fictional sense, exactly the way they define themselves. You can't tell my granddaughter, who's 3, that she isn't Pocahontas. It's stupid to tell her that, because she means it in an experimental sense. And all you're doing is interfering with her fantasy play. And so I see a fair bit of this as delayed fantasy play with the kind of pathology that comes up when you delay a necessary developmental stage. Now, that could be wrong, and probably is, but still, it looks to me like that's part of what's happening. It's very strange to see this insistence. Like, it's so conceptually unsophisticated. Even the hypothesis that identity is only what you feel that it is, and the intense insistence that be the case is also another mystery. It's like, why is it that it's a foregone conclusion that other people have to go along with your self-definition?
So I think, first of all, that's fascinating, and that fits rather exactly with what I'm getting at. And I suspect it is adding a dimension where I was vague about the developmental pathway. But you're absolutely right that a child can take on an identity, and effectively within limits, they are allowed to assert that identity, and adults will play along with it.
Encourage it.
Right. Now, the thing is, there's a process. I'm more familiar with the male side of this because I went through boyhood and being a young man. But if you have a misunderstanding about how you present in the world, so you assert that you are one way, then your peers will, if your peers are nice, they will poke fun at you in order to reveal to you what it is that you actually present as, so that you can adjust your self-image.
Right, and that's part of healthy socialization. That's what happens. That's it. Once you pull out of that egocentric stage where you're playing with yourself, then you have to integrate other people into your play, and then it's a negotiation. Otherwise, right, you're not accepted by your peers. And so that's another thing that's very interesting, is that it is precisely those children who aren't accepted by their peers that insist that their self-definitions rule. And then one of the things that's kind of terrifying about that is, if you know the child antisocial literature, there's a percentage of children that are quite aggressive at the age of 2. Almost all of them are male. Almost all of them are socialized out of their aggression by the time they're 4. The percentage that isn't become persistent lifetime offenders if their behavior isn't rectified by the time they're 4, which means if they're not transformed into children that are acceptable to their peers, there's no intervention that is being evident in the literature that will reverse that.
So this is both frightening and it's making me happy in the sense that I believe that the model that we are wrestling to the surface here is accurate, and it doesn't fit what most people are expecting is going on. And I think there's a lot of power in understanding it this way. But what you are effectively saying is that there's a period in which self-definition is identity in some sense, and then there is a period of correction at which your insistence on who you are meets everyone else's insistence on who you are, and you then learn who you actually are, and that thing better be a pretty good match for the world. But then,
yeah, it better be all right.
Right. And so I have argued as an evolutionist that I would say the job of a parent is to mirror the environment that the child will mature into, so that when they get there, they have the software that is an appropriate match for it. And a lot of mental health issues come down to a mismatch between the software that your developmental environment produced and the environment you actually live in. And that can happen.
That's why you shouldn't be nicer to your children than the world is. In fact, you're doing them a disservice. That's the devouring mother from the psychoanalytic perspective.
Right. And this gets into some very uncomfortable territory. What does good, if you're a slave, if you're born into slavery and you produce children, how should you parent them? Should you protect them from, I would say, all of the implications of slavery? Presumably
let's go through
not.
this stage idea again, because there's 3 stages, I think. There's the egocentric stage, where the child is manifesting multiple identities, self-defined and playing. Then that's under the protection of parents. The parents put up a walled enclosure, so to speak, within which the child can do that experimentation. Then the child meets the world of peers. That happens between the ages of 4 and the ages of 17, 18, something like that. And that's when your identity has to expand to include others in a cooperative and negotiated way. You have to manage competition and cooperation, and your identity becomes socialized. And then there's a stage beyond that, I would say, where you kind of pop out of that socialization and you're no longer necessarily a member of the group. It's like a self-actualized person. Although I don't like that phrase, the self-actualization theorists thought to some degree in this manner. Once you're done with your apprenticeship, you can become post-apprentice, and then you can take control of your own destiny to some degree independently of your peers. So hopefully you can get to there. And so that's part of the answer to the slavery conundrum. You should be a good member of your group, but you shouldn't only be that.
Well, I think there are two different questions. The slavery issue is the very uncomfortable idea that if a parent is supposed to mirror the adult environment that a child will have to get along in, then a person whose children will mature into an arbitrary environment needs to understand that it's an arbitrary environment rather than being protected from it, right? In order to to properly avoid running afoul of the arbitrary authorities in a slave environment, one has to be developmentally brought into how you navigate below the radar, how you play that game. And so anyway, you would expect the parenting to look very different. And, this idea that childhood is, a joyous time where you should be free of all of those adult influences is exactly wrong. It's preparation. So, though now, if we take this model that I think you and I are agreeing on here about the fact that and I like your point here, that there are three stages. You've got, I assert my identity independent of the world, then the world and I negotiate over what my actual identity is, and then I'm not an apprentice anymore and I get to be who I am in the adult world, having been informed by that process. And you imagine that you've got generations now, 1.5 of them maybe, for whom the online environment was so compelling and so much the source of most of their affirmation that its rules have become sacrosanct to them. And those rules really do look like, it's a childish world, right? You join some community of people, you tell them who you are. There are rules about them having to respect who you've told them. It is, if I say I'm Pocahontas, who are you to say I'm not, right? And that in some ways.
Well, the answer to that question in the real world is, I'm someone you have to get along with in repeated interactions. But that may not be the case at all online. That constraint's gone.
You can just pick up and move to the next community.
And that's another thing we should talk about, because another thing that's happening online is that I've detected this recently, is that the online environment is also making everyone acutely paranoid. And I think the reason for that is that it's easy for our thinking to go astray. And as we talked about earlier in this discussion, other people tap you back into shape. And you're surrounded by a kind of random assortment of other people in the real world because you didn't select them. So because it's random, it provides you with what is in essence relatively unbiased feedback information. But online, you can choose your compatriots. And it's likely to be the case that at your weakest point psychologically, you choose the least demanding compatriots. And so your craziest ideas are the least likely to be challenged.
All right. So there's so many interesting threads here. One of them, my guess is you and I will fall out in the same place here. But if you give me a choice between a community that believes everything I believe and one in which people believe very different things, I'm not going to choose the one in which people believe the things I believe, because for one thing, it's the end of growth and it's deathly boring.
I want to object slightly.
Okay.
I've had, and you've had this experience too. I've had the experience of being in an environment where a very large number of people don't agree with me vociferously. And what I would say is a little of that goes a long way. Even if you're a courageous thinker, I'm not going to put myself in that category, but even if you're someone who wants to be able to tolerate dissent, there's a limited amount of dissent that you actually can tolerate. You are going to seek out an environment where most people agree with you, but some people don't some of the time. And it's kind of like listening to music. You'll like music that's optimally different from what you are enjoying right now, right? If it's exactly the same, it's boring. If it's too different, you can't hear it. There's an amount of novelty that you can tolerate, but it's not that large. And so even people who have been trained to look for evidence that disproves their own theories, they're only going to be able to tolerate a tiny bit of that at a time. It's too destabilizing. It's too destabilizing.
Well, all right. So I want to link this back up to what you said before about the 3 stages.
Yeah.
So my experience as a scientist is that my most valuable characteristic is the ability to be completely indifferent to the prevailing wisdom on a given point, right? And I think this is
No personal stake in it.
Well, I may even have a personal stake. I may come up with an idea that compels me that it's probably right, a hypothesis.
Yeah.
And I may advance it and have every single one of my peers say, that's garbage. And my sense is not one of, oh, crap, I've said something bad. My sense is, well, wouldn't that be delightful? If I'm as right as I think I am, then the fact that everybody else doesn't get this makes it even better, right? So my point is, that's not normal. I know that's not normal. And it's not normal for evolutionary reasons that are easy to understand.
No, it takes a lot of training to accomplish that.
Yes, or a developmental environment that rewards it, right?
Sure.
If you have the right experience.
But then again, you said yourself, again, at the beginning of this conversation, think about the preconditions for that is that in order to open yourself up to that sort of criticism, you have to be supported in all sorts of ways, and even so when I'm functioning as a scientist, I am trying to disprove my presuppositions. I'll test them. It's like something manifests itself in an experiment. Then I design 3 or 4 experiments to see if I can make that effect go away. And I do that because I don't want to propagate nonsense and I don't want to pursue nonsense in my own career. But in order to tolerate that, think about how we set up the system is you have to be a tenured professor to do science or have the equivalent position in a research lab. But your economic situation is stabilized. Your social status is stabilized. Like you're protected on 50 fronts. And then you can open the door and say, okay, let's have some novelty come my way. And that's assuming that you're at a point where you can tolerate any novelty at all. And more curious, more open, more emotionally stable, more intelligent people are more compelled by novelty and can handle it better, but still our ability to handle it is pretty low, and we will find environments that mostly reflect back to us what we want, most comforting.
Well, actually, this is fascinating. I wonder if there's not effectively a budget for discordant interactions. And, if we go back to what we were speaking about it at the beginning of the conversation, the fact that not only do Heather and I have a great relationship, but we also speak the same language scientifically. So, it's a kind of across the board sounding board and ability to, I feel no vulnerability there because there's no place where our worldviews aren't compatible. And, I could say similar things about Eric. So what that means is that my budget for discordant interaction is probably larger when I get to the outside world, because I haven't spent it at home or in the context of family or friends. And
you spend it. It is definitely a budgetary phenomenon. You spend you produce a unit of psychophysiological preparation for every unit of uncertainty. And the size of that unit of expenditure varies with your trait neuroticism, because that's like evolution's guess at how dangerous the environment would be. It varies with your position in the social hierarchy, because if you're at the top where you're protected, the consequence of an error is attenuated compared to what it would be at the bottom. And that's why social position modulates serotonergic output. So the higher you are in the hierarchy, the more serotonin dampens your negative emotion to uncertain events. And that's in keeping with your actual fragility. Neuroticism determines it. Social hierarchy determines it. Intelligence determines it to some degree because you're a more effective problem solver if you have a high IQ. But you do pay for uncertainty, because if something's uncertain, you don't know what to do. And so you have to prepare to do everything. And that's unbelievably costly psychophysiologically. It ramps your cortisol production up, and it starts to eat away from future reserves. It's definitely a budgetary process. So.
Yep. All right. So I want to see if there's something more with respect to this model in which for people whose developmental environment has been internet first and who have wrongly encoded the lesson that my identity is mine to define and that those who would challenge it are enemies rather than people doing me a favor of giving me information I don't have about myself. They are enemies to be challenged and driven out. Then this interfaces with those of us for whom the internet is not our primary developmental experience in the following way. And I'm using the case of trans ideology simply because it's the clearest case biologically. But if you take the rules of trans, and I actually believe probably these ought to be the rules online, which is you can present as whatever you want, and by and large, people should just simply treat you that way. And you also, by the way, online have the tools to do that so that you're not creating some kind of unresolvable paradox. But if we then say, okay, the online rules are that there's no such thing as sex because a man can become a woman simply by showing up as one. And then we say, whatever must be true in the real world in order for those rules to be the rules everywhere, we are going to make those things true. Therefore, it must be the case that biology was wrong about sex. And what's more, that because simply saying that you are female is sufficient to put you fully in that category, then therefore whatever morphology and physiology you happen to have at the point that you make that assertion is consistent with being female. And we have the absurd discussion that we now see so regularly about basically, female penises and things like this. And so those of us with real world primacy are constantly saying you can't rewrite the rules of civilization around simple claims in isolation, like all you have to do to be female is say that that's what you are. And that battle is one that is now ironically going to be lost in the real world as a result of the fact that actually political power is accumulating in the hands of those who subscribe to the online rules.
So the identity issue is, it forces us to one of the things I found so challenging about all of this is that these challenges to fundamental assumptions force you to make arguments for things you actually don't know how to argue for. So, for example, what does it mean to be female? Well, I don't know, because no one's actually ever asked me that question. They just act being female and I act being male, whatever that means. And we don't ever sit down and lay out the explicit assumptions. Now, you do that to some degree when you're arguing with your wife about who's going to do what when, and maybe with your mother and with your sister. You have local discussions when roles come into conflict, but you never list the axioms that you're using to do your perceptual categorization. And so then when you're forced to defend your presumption, you don't know how to do it because you don't have the arguments at hand. So to be female, means something like, what do you do? I had a discussion with one of my former students today. We're trying to help people develop this. We're trying to develop this program that helps people identify and then accomplish important life tasks. And it's forced me to think about something I've thought about over years. What are the important life tasks? Like, okay, so you should get educated to the approximate level of your intelligence. You should be employed gainfully, have a job, or maybe if you're lucky, a career. you need an intimate relationship. You should have some friends. You need a family. You need to regulate the world of temptation, drug and alcohol use, that sort of thing. You have to take care of your health. You need to make some productive use of your time outside of work. So there's 8 things. Maybe there's more, but that's sort of 8. And maybe you don't need to be fully accomplished along all of those 8, but they're pretty important and they're not a bad start. And if you can come up with a better list, more power to you. But, well, let's take one. You're going to have a family, an intimate relationship and a family. Well, the classical way of doing that is that someone's male and someone's female, and they get together and they have children, and then they have grandchildren, and that's like a third of your life, or a quarter of your life, or a fifth of your life. I don't care. It's some non-trivial portion of your life. And that identity, male and female, is a precondition to that route through life. And then you have children, and they mean something to you, and they give you something to do, and you have grandchildren, and it's the same thing. So by playing out male and female, it's sort of like you've now occupied 25% of your time productively. That's the role. Okay, let's say we blow that apart. Well, then what? What are we supposed to do then? Because you can't pretend that into existence. And that's the postmodern element of this. This is the refusal of the real world. It's like, okay, we'll make identity entirely mutable. But what the trans kids that came after me in the first demonstration against me, I said, you think I'm your enemy, but I'm not. And the reason I said that, being a clinician, was because I thought, well, you're adopting an identity that there is no rules for. What the hell are you going to do with that? You're inviting so much trouble into your life you can't even possibly imagine it, because you won't know what to do. And people won't know how to treat you. And so where does that leave you? Now, you might say, well, I'm so distraught about the discordance between my psychological state and my biological reality that pales in comparison. And maybe there are situations where that's the case, but man, an identity that doesn't solve the problem of how you're going to live isn't an identity. I don't know what it is, but it's not an identity.
Yep.
And I don't even know how people would change the rules exactly to make that work.
So I agree with you wholeheartedly that effectively our identities are means to an end. And there are conservation laws that apply to the system as a whole. And unfortunately,
yes.
And this is actually essentially the core argument of the book that Heather and I have just completed. But the core argument is we are living in a period of evolutionary hyper-novelty, where human beings are actually the species for which we have the best tools to deal with novel circumstances that our ancestors did not know anything about, but that the rate of change has become so high that there is no conceivable way for us to keep up with it. And what we are effectively watching with this idea, even in principle, yeah. That, the very fact that you can say the environment that we live in is not the one that we were born into, that's way too fast. You may be able to make a discrete jump. Human beings are capable of moving from one habitat to another and figuring out one time what the rules of the new habitat are. But a habitat that is constantly in motion and has become utterly arbitrary with respect to even the most fundamental characteristics is not something to which we can be well adapted, which is causing us to be...
Sounds like a powerful argument for conservatism.
It is.
Yeah, I know. 100%. I understand. Well, I do understand. I do understand that. That is, to the degree that I'm conservative in my outlook, that is the reason. It's like, look, I've kept up, like I've transformed myself multiple times over the years, and I was taken out by this illness, and it isn't obvious to me that I can catch up again. I've caught up a lot, and I've watched my peers, my high school classmates, my university classmates, and I've seen people who don't have one transformation in them. They're people who they adapt to the high school environment, and that's it. That's where they are for the rest of their life. They peak at 17, they're done. They don't change. And then I've seen people who can manage one transformation. I've seen people, much rarer, who can manage 2 or 3, but after that, it's like it gets massive drop off in probability with every demand for transformation. And now, I find myself now, I have to rely on my son for doing some of my technological chores. And I hate that because I stayed on top of it for so long. But I got sick and I fell out, and it isn't obvious to me that I can clamber back in. It's very difficult.
Well, if you'll take some advice from a friend, and I'm not even sure, I'm not sure I even have it fully formulated, but the thing you described earlier in the conversation, the amount of effort it takes for you to get to the point where you can be productive in the day, the amount that is riding on your doing it, the number of people who are listening to you and who basically need your influence in their life. And, in some sense, it is, it's a mythological story. And I know you will have spotted that 1,000 times over, but just the Herculean effort, the tremendous amount that's riding on it, and the degree to which you're paying some inhuman price in order just to continue playing your role is profound. And so the advice, to the extent that I have
don't see how you can see that. It shocks me that you say that. I mean, that isn't to say
You disagree?
No. It seems like that from inside here.
Well, I mean, I think, But
I can't, having said that, I still can't believe it.
So what I think I would do in your shoes, and what I hope you will do, is you will, I don't think there's anything about that story that isn't right. I think you're reporting honestly how hard it is. And I know, because I've seen it in person and everywhere else, I've seen the effect that you're having on people. And I know how important it is in keeping them out of trouble and steering them in the right direction and giving them hope. And so what I would hope is that instead of reinventing yourself again or updating yourself, that you would figure out what the efficient way of showing up in the world in that role is, and
I hope that's why we're having this conversation. I seem to be able to do this, so I can do this, and so that's what I'm doing. And I have this book coming out, and we'll see how that goes.
But I mean, I think, I know your audience, and they'll accept you any way you can show up for them. And I think, the key thing is to figure out how to get out of the predicament of having to go through that Herculean struggle every day. Yeah,
well, it's beyond. I've been struggling with it for 2 years. I can't get out of it. I can't. Well, I mean, I'm out of it to some degree. I'm living at home again. I'm not in the hospital. But the reason I'm not in the hospital is because there's nothing that can be done for me in the hospital. Like, there's no point in me going to a hospital. It will just make it worse. When I wake up in the morning, like any sensible person would go to the emergency room and say, look, this just isn't possible. But it's irrelevant, because all that will happen, and I've been in like 4 hospitals, so I know all that happens is I'm made much worse. And so I live in 15-minute increments, fundamentally.
Wow. Well, I hope you can detect how many people are rooting for you.
It's mind-boggling. It's life-preserving, that fact. And I can't believe it. Even after this last London Times interview, the amount of support that came pouring in is just unbelievable. I can't wrap my head around it. I don't get it.
Well,
but there it is,
There it is. But I mean, it makes sense, because those of us who have been on your team or paying attention to you for the last several years know who you are. And I think in some sense, your enemies know what you are. They know that a voice like yours carries a tremendous amount of weight, that their fictions will not survive in the context of a countervailing force like that. And so that's why they come after you the way that they do. But, the fact is, people are getting wiser over time. They're recognizing what an attack looks like. At some level, they vary a little bit aesthetically, but the overall picture is the same.
There's a new one planned, apparently. So the next thing, the next thing, this is something that hasn't happened yet, but is apparently coming. A financial expose of my economic existence. So, which will be accompanied by claims that I'm exploiting everyone. And well,
yes, they're going to come after you for succeeding and for people doing, what they can in order to get you to keep going.
I live such a sybaritic existence. I drink sparkling water and nothing else ever. And I eat nothing but meat ever. And so my luxuries, this is so it's so absurd. My luxuries have been high-end toothpicks and sparkling water.
Well, I sometimes wonder when I look at attacks on you, if the idea is this. There are a certain number of people who haven't spent any time listening to you yet. And if they did, they would quickly gather that you're not what your enemies are portraying you as. So the idea is there has to be a constant stream of suggestions that there's something deeply wrong with you in order to get people not to check in with that question. It's like, Julian Assange, right? The number of things that have been said about Julian Assange that would make you think, well, I don't know what's going on there, but
something is going on. Yes, right.
Right. And so the idea is it has the stink that they create around you or Julian Assange or another figure that they regard as very dangerous has to be sufficient to drive most people away from even checking for themselves. And I don't think it's working in your case, but I do think
so far it doesn't seem to. But there's always the possibility that it'll be the next one that'll work. And it's not like I have any shortage of things wrong with me. There are things wrong with me, Now, whether they're ethical things or not, that's a whole different question. But like no one has an untrammeled conscience. That's for sure. So, and I'm not too worried about the economic attack. I mean, I'll just make if it gets out of hand, I'll just make all my finances public. I mean, I've never made any apologies for being an evil capitalist. So I think actually all the things I've done, I've tried to use market forces to modify because I think it's a really good source of feedback. Like I've produced these processes to help people plan and assess their personalities. And, we thought about giving them away for free, but free is actually a really bad price. And once you start making things and starting to put them out in the environment, you find out very rapidly that pricing is very complex and you have to get the price right. And free is not the right price. First of all, if people will only use it if it's free, it might actually not be any good. And that's a signal. So why not use that signal? That's how it's appeared to me. And then you have to make the thing sustain itself, so it has to generate some income. And anyhow, that from what I've heard, that's the next thing that's going to happen. So,
yeah.
We should stop pretty quick, I guess. Although I'm really enjoying this, and we will definitely do it again. I would really like that. I had a very fun conversation with you. It's so nice to talk about what are essentially scientific hypotheses. I miss that so much because I don't have my graduate students anymore. Your life has changed dramatically. If you could have taken a route, I guess I'm asking, would you do it again? But I don't want to ask that in a cliched way. And maybe it's a stupid question because you just don't know. But
no,
are you okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, if I think about it logically, would I do it again? In a heartbeat. There are a few things I might do slightly differently, but I'm not even compelled. I think it went pretty well in light of what the forces in play were. But, the thing that we've lost is security, right? The
Definitely.
fact is,
and
world.
I mean, you got a settlement from the university, but that was a trivial proportion of your future, or your mutual future earnings. It was nothing. It was enough so you didn't starve to death immediately, but that was all.
Right. And if I'm honest about it, we were forced to move out of our home to a different city. We uprooted our children's lives, which was quite disruptive. But I really don't feel there was any choice. I don't, if I think about it as a matter of choice, I cannot find the circuit that would have done anything differently. And I'm not, all I can say is our lives are full of purpose and we're doing fine. The absence of security is something I think about a lot, but yes, I would say there wasn't any choice, nor should there have been. And I'm not sorry I made the choices I did in the slightest.
Well, you look good, man. And you look, if you don't mind me saying, you look different than you did when I saw you before.
Well, I'm older now.
Well, but I've noticed this in my clinical clients when they integrate their aggression, their faces harden. And they look determined all of a sudden instead of questioning. And you look like that more than you did. Now, some of that's from getting older, but not all of it.
Well, I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's probably a lot about, getting catapulted into the big leagues and learning to play that role. It's, it's trial by fire, but certainly it's been fascinating, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next.
Famous last words.
Yeah, that's ominous coming from you, Jordan.
Look, it was great to see you. Say hi to Heather for me.
I sure will. And
be
Jordan,
nice to talk to her too.
I can't tell you how relieved we were to hear that Tammy had recovered and that you were back. And I know it's a rough road, but hang in there, brother. We need you. And there are so many people who are just thrilled that you've come back from hell to rejoin the battle.
All right. So soon we'll talk again.
Great. Be well, Jordan.